Okay, so I also want to say a couple other things regarding the principle-based response before I move on. One, let's assume there is something that I have called in other presentations an omega point, which is some point of first order theological knowledge where hypothetically you can know with complete certainty which church is the true church. I've been skeptical that such a point exists because I haven't seen a minimal fact set, that corresponds to it. But I don't claim to know so much. How to put it? If I said I'm skeptical, I know that it doesn't exist. It's like that would be itself a weird claim to total theological knowledge, which I can't coherently make as a theological skeptic, right? So I allow for the possibility that it exists. So assuming that Catholicism is true, and there is this omega point where, if you know enough theology, you can know that the Catholic Church is true, in the sense of like having truly justified true belief. Still, that's like a high, as I argued through the minimal fact set challenge, that's a very, very high level of justification that only a few are ever able to attain, intellectually speaking, at least. Can God give you an inner knowing that doesn't depend on that? Yes, because he's omnipotent. Now, is it logically possible for him to do that? That doesn't also entail that he's like infused some actual propositional knowledge into your mind. I don't know. I would tend to assume it's not logically possible without that also being the case, but it doesn't really matter. But as far as intellectually, only a very few are ever going to attain it. Hold on just a moment. So anyway, let's say that omega point is the true meta. Well, I think it stands to reason that however difficult that realization is, it's not as difficult to realize as the realization that most people aren't capable of realizing it. And you can have that realization while you apprehend the omega point, or if you're in that sort of valley where like on one side is the Dunning-Kruger effect, inside the valley is realizing, theology is actually really hard, and on the other end is the omega point. You don't see the omega point, but you do realize that it's really hard. I would say, like, if 0.1% can attain the omega point, then at least like 5 or 10% can sort of realize that the omega point is really hard to attain if it exists at all. So there's a certain way where offering a method of finding the true church reliably that just requires you to realize that the omega point is really hard to attain represents a sort of local maximum. Maybe it can't get any easier than that, because maybe theology again is so hard to figure out that most people can't even figure out that it's hard to figure out, and we can even suppose that failure is for good faith reasons. But it would still remain the case, arguably, that God has done all that he logically can done. And so far as we're giving the sort of principles-based defense, we can see that it behooves God to offer a method of finding the true church reliably that bears correspondence to the facts. Namely, the facts are that you're not competent to find the true church reliably based on your own personal theological acumen, whether or not you think you are, or whether or not most people realize that. It would behoove God to, in his goodness and truthfulness, to offer a method that sort of does justice to the truth, or it fits with the truth. It reflects the fact that we really aren't, such that it's a method that you're only going to turn to if you realize your own limitations, let's say, and whether or not most people do realize their limitations, and whether or not those are for good or bad reasons. It's still like maybe this is the most that logically can be done, and what he must do, he's not going to offer some kind of sugar-coated or fake way of finding the true church that just flatters us or something, or it takes it I can't easily think of an example, but a fundamentally deceptive way of finding the true church that will guide you to the true church if you make the mistaken assumption that you are competent to figure out theology when you're really not. I can't easily think of what that would be or how he would do that, but I don't think he would tend to do that because he's truthful. But with God, a lot of the time it's not an either or. You don't have to choose. God doesn't usually, a lot of time, I don't think God has to choose between principles or outcomes, ends or means. He can usually have both. So here's how I'm going to illustrate that. Someone could listen to my principles-based response and say, you know what? I don't care. I care about cold, hard outcomes. I'm like a utilitarian or a consequentialist or something. I think that what matters is what actually happens. And so that you can object that as a matter of fact, there aren't enough people availing themselves of this supposed mechanism for finding the true church for us to say that it represents any improvement over the state of affairs where there isn't a method to find the true church. But it turns out that if you judge the church finding mechanism, that is the papacy, on outcomes rather than principles, Catholicism is still the clear winner. Because it turns out basically every Catholic, and in some sense that is most believers, because they're half of believers roughly, and half is a majority in some sense of the word majority. It turns out that every Catholic is using this method in addition to whoever is, every Catholic is using this method of finding the true church through the papacy, albeit not always, or maybe not usually, in conscious answer to the question of how do I find the true church? What should I do to find the true church reliably? But rather in answer to the question of what do I as a Catholic do? Whom should I as a Catholic obey? Because in some sense, the Catholic Church just is the church that is in communion with the Bishop of Rome. And so about half of Christianity is using this method all the time. Well, in addition, say, to whoever is consciously converting to Catholicism because of either a first order theological case, they believe in the papacy on factual grounds, or they believe in it for a priori grounds, like the disjunctive argument that I'm making. So in addition to all those people who are using it consciously, which I admit it might be a very small percent of believers, we have all these people who are sort of using it unconsciously. And it turns out that's how, assuming Catholicism is true, a majority of Christians have stayed in the true church throughout history despite all the twists and turns of councils and controversies, even if they're not doing so, again, in answer to the question of how do I find the true church, or how do I find the fullness of correct theology, and even if they're not doing so for the reasons that I'm arguing you should use it for, namely because of the difficulty of theology. It may be that when theological or political or social controversies arise, most people have a tendency to more or less unthinkingly submit to their ultimate ecclesial superior, which, for everyone at one point what was the Pope, at least in some nominal sense, until he fell into error. And even if only in a purely honorary sense, and even if only until the point where he fell into definite theological error on whatever non-Catholic view you may have. And so if it's true that people have this tendency to just more or less unthinkingly, most people tend to submit to their ultimate ecclesial superior when there's a controversy rather than think through it for themselves, then at some level of explanation, this may go some way toward explaining why Catholicism has a numerical majority now, and to my knowledge has pretty much always had one. So going on a purely consequentialist basis, the providence of God is extremely successful on Catholicism, at least far more so than on any other version of Christianity. And if you judge the mechanism of the papacy based on principles, and I am correct in what I have said about the difficulty of theology, then the papal mechanism of finding the true church has the merit of being a truthful one, in addition to being the most that God can have done, arguably. And it may also be that in many cases people do not have good reasons for not availing themselves of the papacy, as we will see in the following thought experiment. So here are the stakes of the question, to be Catholic or not. I'm going to argue this really has a moral dimension as well as an epistemic dimension, because it really becomes a referendum on, do I think I'm competent to figure out basically all of theology for myself or not? Do I think I'm competent to rely on myself or lean on my own understanding? Or am I humble enough about my limitations to realize that I'm not? So, as a further way to clarify my point, I invite the critic to ask themselves, okay, hold on. Yeah, let's imagine the following scenario. In the following scenario, non-Catholicism is true, and I, a Catholic, am hypothetically interrogated upon my death by an angel as to why I wasn't an Eastern Orthodox. Or let's say I'm not interrogated, but let's say he asked me, so, this was the true church, why weren't you part of it? And I would say, well, there wasn't a reliable mechanism. And so that's almost, again, could be taken as making an indictment against God. So the angel's going to make some kind of defense. But if theology, or could be expected to make some kind of defense, but if theology is really as hard as I've been suggesting it is, then what can the angel really say besides, that was lamentable, because before the primatial leader fell into error, people were able to just be in the true church by submitting to their superior. And so things were working according to God's plan then, but later things got out of hand in terms of God's permissive will. It wasn't his design, but the Pope fell into error. God willed that the Pope should have stayed Orthodox and stayed pious, etc. But the Pope didn't do that. But that's human freedom, not God's fault. And admittedly, after that, it got super hard to figure out what the true church is. So if what you're saying is you weren't smart enough, all right, fine. I guess you have an excuse. That's something like how I imagine it might go if it came to that at all. I'm not assuming it will, but I am assuming that this question is worth treating of as if it were, this important. Because if it's not, why are we bothering to figure out which church is the true church? I'm not saying God's going to be vindictive and really come after you if you weren't in the right church, even if it wasn't always for the best reasons. But I am saying that if we don't treat this question as if it had this level of importance, I'm not sure that it's really worth delving into. So that's why I sort of act as if there's going to be an angel interrogating you, etc. All right, now, so that's what happens if I'm not Catholic. But if I am, let's say if Catholicism, that's what happens if I'm Catholic, but Catholicism isn't true, right? Now, this is what happens if Catholicism is true, but I'm not Catholic because I'm, say, Eastern Orthodox. And I am talking more about Eastern Orthodoxy and the other ancient churches here because I think the Catholic case against Protestantism has been done to death. I do talk about Protestantism, but I want an argument that sort of works against every non-Catholic position, and one that makes special reference to the ancient churches, because I feel like at least online, that's where the energy has shifted to. This is the debate that's more current. If Catholicism is true and I, an Eastern Orthodox, am interrogated upon my death as to why I wasn't Catholic, I feel that the probability of A star, or let me just say, I feel that the difficulty of theology is sufficiently high that there is some danger of the conversation going like this. Why weren't you Catholic, the angel says. And I say, I was confident that the theological facts on the ground indicated Eastern Orthodoxy. But the angel can say, why were you so confident? Wouldn't you realize that, even really smart people could disagree about these things? it would be one thing to say, well, I wasn't confident, but it was my best guess. But if you say I was super confident, despite the fact that super smart, humble people could look at the same facts and reach different conclusions, that seems like it's running the risk of intellectual pride. So now I backpedal and I say, well, okay, I wasn't so confident. Theology was confusing for me, as it was for maybe most everyone else. However, I didn't have any reason to believe that God would have provided a way for me or anyone else to identify the true church in this climate of confusion. But then the angel can say, why did you assume that God wouldn't provide for your needs? Was that not unbelief? And is it not the case that whatever doesn't proceed from faith is sin? Like I think it says in Romans 14:3. Could be wrong about that, but I think I have the citation later. And I want to also say this in a footnote. It is possible that one may not have realized that the question of Catholicism versus non-Catholicism possesses this moral/epistemic dimension. One may not have realized, in other words, that communion with the Bishop of Rome is effectively a bet that finding the true church doesn't depend on personal theological acumen / a bet that God has provided a way for you to find the true church despite the objective difficulty of theology. And that conversely, non-communion with Rome is, in the limit, it's a bet that you are competent to find the true church by judging some or all of the facts on the ground for yourself, and or that it's a bet on God's non-provision, right? It's a bet that even if it is this hard, he won't have done for us. And so this is when you look at it this way, there's not just a purely abstract, it's not just purely abstract anymore. There's a serious sort of moral dimension to this, at least assuming the truth of theism and Christianity. And although you might not have realized that this debate had this dimension until now, you should realize it now. Like Hegel said, to know a limit as a limit is already to be beyond the limit. Once you've heard this presentation, at least, you will no longer have grounds for pleading ignorance. And you can say, well, why did you do that to me? Well, it's like, we don't say it was wrong to bring the gospel to unevangelized peoples because now they run the risk of hellfire. We understand if they reject it. We understand that more knowledge is good. The truth is good. All right. So besides, the angel might well add, what was God supposed to do other than what on Catholicism he already did? Was he supposed to make theology easy? Can he make physics easy without changing it? And unlike physics, theology flows from God's nature, was immutable, etc. All right. So in other words, the question before us is, in which case are we at greater risk of being found guilty of some measure of bad faith or otherwise being found culpable for our ignorance? On non-Catholicism, if theology is as difficult as I have argued it to be, the risk is that I would be held liable for my failure to understand something that was arguably beyond my intellectual ability to understand, which is like not a really high risk. It's not a failure, seemingly, that a loving and merciful God would be likely to punish. However, on Catholicism, the danger is that I might rightly be convicted of either intellectual pride on the one hand or unbelief on the other. This is like a Scylla and Charybdis situation. And so that is a sort of Pascal's wager type of reason to assume that Catholicism is true or act as if it's true, because like in I guess Pensée, Blaise Pascal basically says, from what I understand, if you're in a deadlock as between does God exist or does he not, don't just treat it like an abstract question. Get the will involved to sort of break the deadlock. Ask yourself, which one do you have more to lose on? Because if God exists, but you act as if he don't, as if he doesn't, then you have everything to lose. But if he doesn't exist and you act as if he does, then you have really nothing to lose. And so I'm saying in a similar way, Catholicism is the morally safer option by a logic similar to Pascal's wager. Now, for whatever weird reason, I feel like this is an okay consideration to take in the question of which church is the true church, even though when it comes to arguing for God, I don't like Pascal's wager. And I'm not even fully sure why I don't like it in that context, but for whatever reason, I'm just recording that I've never been the most comfortable with Pascal's wager, but I do seem to be comfortable with it in this context. Maybe I shouldn't be. I don't know, but I just do note this Pascal's wager type of logic. All right. So let's talk about the endgame here. Now, this is drawn from almost like the transcript of a recording that I made to myself. It's not the most polished slide by any means, but it does help me keep track of my points. So let me begin my sort of conclusion. What I think I've shown at a minimum is that if the true church can only be found through personal theological acumen, and we already talked about the limits of saying it can be found in other ways, like it can be found if you're holy enough, or if you can find out which church has the holiest people, well, if other people are in a different church, are you confident that it's because they're less holy than you? Or other people join a different church because they think it has holier saints, but you know that your church has the holiest saints. On what does your superior competence to judge the holiness, the superior holiness of your saints rest? I don't know what it would rest on except your own hypothetically greater personal holiness, and humility is part of holiness, such that holy people don't usually claim to be holier than thou, and you could say maybe the true church, it can be found in a non-intellectual way through beauty. The most true church will always be the most beautiful one, but I don't know that there's any necessary relationship between those two things. We can imagine a beautiful church, and also beauty is quite, even if it's actually objective, it's quasi-subjective in the sense that people disagree over it very much. So it's not reliable in the sense that if you ask 100 people what's the most beautiful church, they'll all give you the same answer. So that's why I didn't talk about those other ways. I just been treating it as if it were academic. And I know that it does seem a little mad to do that, but that was the method to my madness. And so, I think what I've shown at a minimum is that if the true church can only be found through personal theological acumen, there is certainly no reliable way for the average person to find it, or any of those other ways, really. Because, the average person is supposed to find the true church by being sufficiently holy. It's like, is the church there to make unholy people holy, or is it only there to be discerned by that elite few who are already holy? You know what I mean? This is really if Catholicism is not true, there is no reliable way to find the true church for the average person. I think that is like beyond doubt. Regarding whether a reliable way to find the true church exists for the cognitive elite, I'm also skeptical. As far as I'm concerned, being smarter doesn't actually increase your chances of finding it through personal theological acumen, or studying it more doesn't even increase your chances, because if you start off on the wrong assumptions, you'll be wasting all your effort. And there's sort of which assumption to start on is sort of this mire, this quagmire, as I showed in the criterial regress portion of this presentation. Your starting point can never really be principled, on pain of trying to follow an infinite regress to its non-existent terminus. Regarding whether a reliable way to find the true church exists for the cognitive elite, I will be skeptical until a minimal fact set surfaces that forces every pair of people who look at it to reach the same conclusion. assuming they are aware, of all those facts, or those facts have been spelled out in sufficient detail, that people who look at that set can be aware of the totality of the facts in that set. So, can it be rational to believe in Eastern Orthodoxy or Presbyterianism, at least where we restrict ourselves to analysis of the first order theological data? I, for one, would not dispute that it is rational to believe in Eastern Orthodoxy or Presbyterianism, where we are limiting ourselves to analysis of the facts on the ground. That is, if we're excluding second-order considerations like the disjunctive argument that I've made. But where it is also rational to believe in Catholicism on the basis of the same set of facts, which I would not dispute either, that can only mean that analysis of these facts does not represent a reliable means of identifying the true church. Take a little pause here. So we're going to come into the end game now. So this is kind of where I'm reading from that transcript almost. So there's that angle where God is good. Therefore, if the church is something actually worth finding, he will have made a reliable way to find it. And based on that information, you can validly deduce the existence of a reliable way to find the true church, regardless of how many people end up taking it and for what exact reasons. So, you can validly deduce the existence of a reliable way to find the true church, also regardless of how many other people are willing or able to make that same sort of deduction. And I think, to a large degree, I think it's actually a willingness thing, or a lack of willingness, more than it is an ability thing. But the point is, once we begin on the assumption that there is a reliable way to find the true church, that basically begs the question against every non-Catholic version of Christianity, because it turns out that only on Catholicism is there a reliable way to find the true church. The method of submitting to Rome is reliable if Catholicism is true, in the sense that 100 times out of 100, it lands you in the true church because of papal infallibility. The Pope is divinely protected on Catholicism from ever binding the faithful to error. So there's a way that even just for us to assume that there's a reliable way to find the true church already begs the question against non-Catholic Christianity. And is that move already too fast? Is it too cheap? Is it too easy? So now we've got to dwell on the meta of, is it even worth it to address the question of which church is the true church if you don't begin from the assumption that there's a way to find it reliably? Because arguably at that point, it doesn't matter, either because it's practically impossible and therefore not worth bothering with, or it just happens not to be important, and that's why God didn't provide a reliable way to find it. And so there is a certain way in which one shoots oneself in the foot if one doesn't begin from the assumption that there is a reliable way to find the true church. And I also showed, in a Pascal's wager type way, that while there are significant risks to assuming non-Catholicism, there are virtually no risks to assuming Catholicism, given the actual difficulty of theology. So that right from the outset, just even the most basic game theoretic considerations are tilting you inevitably, like irresistibly, toward Catholicism, almost regardless of what the facts on the ground ultimately end up proving, if they do ultimately end up proving anything. Because as I said, if non-Catholicism is true, it's only because it would seem to only be because things got out of hand in terms of God's permissive will, and people couldn't find, and the reason why people can't find the true church on non-Catholicism is basically they're not smart enough. Even if they were willing, they wouldn't be able. but probably people won't be held responsible for that, whereas they might be held responsible for assuming they knew more than they did, or not trusting in God's provision to have provided a means of finding the true church where theology is as difficult as it is. So I would say this is the meta of whether there's a reliable way to find the true church or not. And if you really try not to beg the question against non-Catholic Christianity, and you enter into this field of inquiry, into this search for the true church, without presupposing some reliable way to find the true church, this is the sort of landscape, this bleak wasteland that you end up facing. Either Catholicism is true, or the question is basically not worth bothering with, such that in the end, you're forced almost on purely pragmatic grounds to throw in your lot with the only system that is even possibly offering a reliable way to find the true church. So that is the conclusion of my presentation. And I guess my hair got mussed because I always kind of mess with my hair when I'm talking. So yeah, that is the presentation. I tried to cover what I thought would be the most dangerous objections to my position in this conclusion. However, you may have thought of some objections that I didn't cover, in which case I would like to hear them, because I'm assuming my argument is valid. But if I've made a mistake or a logical flaw, if there's a logical flaw, then it might not be valid. I would like to know what you think is the logical flaw, if you think there is one. I would ask, if you think that there's a flaw, please ensure that you've watched every part of the series, because already I've seen some comments that suggest that they watched part 2 but they didn't watch part 1, and I know from the view count that, so for whatever reason, a lot more people watch part 2 than part 1. And so what I am saying is that if you think you've detected a logical flaw or fallacy in my argument, please make sure that you've seen the whole thing before you tell me what you think that flaw is. I know it's a lot to watch or listen to, but that's just sort of what I'm asking, because it may be that I have covered it. But either way, I am grateful for your time and attention in listening to this series. And I pray that God blesses you. I pray that you also don't take anything that I said in the wrong way. Again, I don't think God is really going, I believe in the mercy of God. I don't believe that, and I don't believe that anyone's going to get all of theology right either. Or even if they are right, they might be sort of intellectually proud at the same time, and then they have greater reason to fear the wrath of God than if they were wrong but humble. And so I do think ultimately it's a heart question. I think when we're talking about which church is the true church, that's more like the letter of the law. The spirit of the law, the spirit is what's your heart posture toward God, and you can have that heart posture that's right in any church, as far as I can see, at least any Orthodox one, but maybe even in some ones that are wrong about the Trinity. I don't know, but I would stick to the Trinitarian ones to be safe. But what do I know? I'm just a layperson. So yeah, there's also a certain way where if I've said anything that conflicts with actual Catholic doctrine, then please, I'm not speaking for the Catholic Church. I'm speaking for myself. The views and opinions here are not necessarily by any means those of the Catholic Church. Please know that. I think that about covers it. Again, the only reason why I'm taking this question so seriously is I'm assuming it's worth taking that seriously, but it doesn't mean that God is going to actually come after you for making an honest mistake. God forbid. I'm not saying that. I don't think that for a second. And I do think, as I said, the whole problem is that you've got arbitrarily smart, good, sincere, holy people on every point of the ecclesial map. They're all going to heaven as far as I know. And it's not like they're seriously going to get in trouble for what turned out to be an honest mistake. I've said again and again that I think it's possible to disagree with the Catholic position in good faith. And that's sort of the problem with the sort of minimal fact set problem. That's sort of the problem that is illustrated by the minimal fact set challenged. So yeah, hopefully nothing I said will be taken the wrong way. I do pray again that God blesses you if you're seeking, and that he guides you into the truth. You can be right for the wrong reasons and wrong for the right reasons. And I pray that you go where God wants you to go in this season. I pray that you would get what you need on your particular spiritual journey, which is not the same for everyone. I do think that there's this way that if we're making the case, if we're playing the game, I hope that it's still recording. If we're making the case, we're playing the game of which church is the true church. There's sort of, to the extent we're playing that game at all, I think Catholicism is the best answer to that. That doesn't. That's not to say that each person's situation is unique. So again, I do pray that you become Catholic, because as far as I can see, that is the fullness of the truth. But fundamentally, I pray that you get what you need on your particular spiritual journey, and that your faith in Jesus deepens. And if you wouldn't mind praying for me after having watched this presentation, that would be terrific. So again, God bless you. Thank you for listening.